I'm Nadia Swart for BizNews.com, and with me today is Dr. William Happer, a physicist, Emeritus Professor at the University of Princeton, but best known for, even notorious, his rejection of the scientific consensus on climate change. Professor Happer, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
You've had a remarkable life. Can you tell me a little bit about your early years, where you grew up, what your life was like?
Well, I'm a physicist, but I was actually born in India. My mother was a medical missionary there, and my father was in the British Army. He was a physician too. So, Army doctor and a missionary doctor were my parents. And I was born just before World War II started. So when World War II began, Japanese were moving rapidly in Burma. They took Singapore quickly, and people thought that they would soon take India. So my father would have to go to war with the rest of the British Army, and he was worried about his family. He thought the Japanese might overrun India, so he sent my mother and me back to America. My mother was American, and so we took a ship from Bombay around South Africa. So I don't remember it, but I've been in Cape Town at the age of about, 12 months or something like that. And so we came to America, and my mother needed a job, and my uncle was a physicist who was working in the Manhattan Project, to make the American atomic bomb.
Mm-hmm.
So he recruited my mother to go to Oak Ridge, where they did the uranium separation for the Hiroshima bomb. And so as a small child, as a toddler, preschooler, I was surrounded by physicists and chemists and mathematicians and engineers, and it was like a fascinating way to make a living. So I thought then, even before I'd gone to school, maybe this is something I could do if I work hard at it. And so I did. And so here I am many years later. I'm a physicist. And so it was because of these sort of accidents of my early life.
When was, if in fact there was a specific moment that you looked at the data and the prevailing science on climate change and just thought to yourself, something's off, this is not right?
I got interested in climate because one of my jobs was director of energy research, U.S. Department of Energy in the 1990s, early part of that decade. And so I was responsible for all of the basic research done in the Department of Energy, and that included many different fields. There was high energy physics, there was plasma physics, material science. We even were a major player in the Human Genome Project because, Department of Energy had long been interested in effects of radiation on heredity, on genes. But one of the other areas I was responsible for was environmental sciences and climate. And so I had never paid much attention to this before. I'm a hard physicist, and I'm interested in these areas, but I hadn't focused on them. And I tried to understand what we were spending taxpayers' money for, to do research. And to help me do that, I would have some principal investigator come in every week and give me personally a seminar, and my assistant directors in Washington. And we would learn about progress in the search for the top quark at Fermilab, or progress in more efficient sequencing of genes in the Human Genome Project. It was all interesting stuff. And the people that we invited were usually very pleased to come to Washington and talk to some bureaucrat who was really interested in what they were doing. That's not normal, but it was good for me. But there was one exception when we would invite someone in from the climate business, which was already becoming of great interest then. They would frequently refuse to come. I remember one said, "Well, I work for Senator Gore, and I don't work for you." I said, "Well, you better read your contract. It's okay with me if you don't want to work with us, and but don't bother asking for more money next year." And then, of course, they came, gave a grudging seminar, but they were mostly like that. When we would get someone in who was connected in one way with climate, one way or another, they were always very evasive, very hostile almost. And the seminars were strange. In a normal seminar, scientific seminar, you ask a lot of questions. How do you calibrate this instrument? What are the sources of systematic errors? And that's completely normal part of science. But those same questions, if you asked about, how you calibrate a thermometer or something that's important for climate, or the response would be, "Don't you trust me? Why are you asking this?" So, so it was a completely different response. And so I was amazed, because this is my first contact with this field, and it was so different from the many others that we were supporting. So it was clearly different.
2 years later, in 1993, you were dismissed by the Clinton administration because allegedly you butted heads with Al Gore. So what's the story?
Yeah, well, of course, Clinton and Gore won the election and came aboard in 1993. And I was a political appointee, so I expected to be fired and to go home, but they asked me to stay and help a little bit, during the transition, and I agreed to do that. So I stayed on. I was really the only political appointee left in the Department of Energy. But, science in those days was considered to be apolitical, and so it was not so unusual. It had happened before. It doesn't normally last very long, because, when you win an election, you have to pay back your supporters with jobs in Washington, and I had one of the jobs that they could use. That was all right with me. I was eager to go home. I didn't like being a bureaucrat particularly. I preferred doing research. And but I was there, and the new Secretary of Energy, Hazel O'Leary, was a Afro-American woman, very elegant woman from Tidewater, Virginia. I was from North Carolina, so we had that in common. We liked the same food, for example. And so amazingly, I got on well with Hazel. Hazel was very good to me, very fair, and interested in what we were doing. And one day she called me in and she said, "Will, what have you done to Al Gore?" I just got this message from the White House that I've got to get rid of you immediately. And I said, "Well, I haven't done anything to him, but, I ask questions in seminars where people he supports feel like they're being attacked, but I ask questions of everybody else too, so they're certainly not being singled out." And she says, "Well, Gore's really mad at you, and I have to fire you, but I can keep you on as a civil servant. I'll hire you as a normal civil servant rather than a political person." And I said, "Well, that's very kind, Hazel. I mean, but it's, I can't wait to get home. I'm eager to go home, and good luck, goodbye." So that was the end of my career at Department of Energy, and I was very glad to get back to Princeton. They fortunately offered me a job. I had to resign my job at Princeton to go to work for Department of Energy because it would have been a conflict of interest. I was supporting uh, the plasma physics lab at Princeton through my office, and that would have been a clear conflict. So they didn't have to rehire me, but they did. Even though Gore had fired me, they were happy to have me back.
Back to the conflicting ideas between you and Al Gore. Did it, as expressed in the media, have to do with your viewpoint on the ozone hole, which differed substantially from his?
Yeah, I mean, the ozone problem was front and center then. That was the time when they signed the Montreal Protocol to phase out, freons and things like that, which people thought were contributing to ozone depletion. I don't think it's to this day very clear whether it had any effect at all. Certainly, I mean, the ozone hole is still there, many, many years later. If you look at the early attempts to measure ozone around the world, it was probably there in the 30s too. It wasn't new. Yeah, it was new to satellites, but satellites themselves were new, right? So
Mm.
the freons that we were using were really good. They were the
Mm.
most efficient refrigerants you could make, and they were safe. You could breathe them. They were not toxic. They
Mm.
were not flammable. They're really good things. And so you hate to give up something that is quite good. DuPont uh, didn't agree that, they had some new refrigerants that were under patent. And so they made huge profits as a result of the Montreal Protocol. So they were big supporters of the protocol. But it meant, that the refrigerators had to be changed. Uh, and you paid more to run your refrigerator because they weren't as efficient. So for these reasons, I wanted to be sure that we were making this step advisedly based on good science. And the real issue wasn't the ozone hole over Antarctica. Nobody lives in Antarctica, and the sun there doesn't get very high over the horizon anyway, so the hole doesn't matter because the light is coming through very dense slant directions of air. So the problem was, is there more ultraviolet light in latitudes where people live, you know, Cape Town or Princeton or London, and we had measurements for most of those places, and none of the measurements showed much change. If anything, there seemed to be less ultraviolet reaching the ground. So it wasn't at all clear that there was a problem that needed to be solved. And so I pointed this out, here's the data, and they would brush aside the data and say, this is what my model shows. And of course, the model showed that everybody was dropping dead of skin cancer, and which wasn't true. It wasn't even close to being true.
On the point of CO2, you have gone a step further and claimed that not only is it not a pollutant, but there's a net benefit to more CO2. Can you unpack that for me?
Well, yes. I mean, it just is amazing when I hear people talk about carbon pollution. Of course, what they're talking about is CO2. Carbon, comes in many forms. Pure carbon, for example, you mine in South Africa as diamonds. That's pure carbon, and so diamonds, I suppose, are carbon pollution, and you know, graphite is pure carbon, but carbon dioxide is really what they mean. They don't mean diamonds or coal, at least not in coal's original form. When you burn coal, you turn it into carbon dioxide. But carbon dioxide is what drives life on Earth. The growth of plants depends on carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide in the air diffuses into the leaves of plants through little holes, and the plants combine that with water, and you need energy to do that. The energy comes from sunlight. So the combination of carbon dioxide, this so-called pollutant, water, and sunlight is what makes life. That's what we live on. And carbon dioxide at the present time is much lower concentration than has prevailed over most of geological history. Most of geological history, it's pretty clear from proxy records that CO2 levels have been 2 or 3 times greater than they are now. We probably don't have enough fossil fuels around to restore those levels where plants evolved and where they function best. But even the relatively small increases we've had from, maybe 280, 300 parts per million 200 years ago to a little over 400 today, that's not a big increase. It's 35% maybe. And but it has caused greening all around the Earth. You can see that from satellites looking down over the last 2 or 3 decades. Earth is getting greener. Especially arid regions are getting greener. The edges of the great deserts of the Earth are shrinking. They're not growing. They're shrinking. they're shrinking because of more CO2. And the reason for that is that there are a number of benefits from more CO2, but one of the most important ones is that if there's more CO2, plants can live with less water. They don't waste as much water with more CO2 in the air because they grow leaves with fewer holes in them, so they don't leak as much water. And the little holes, the stomata, the little mouths is what it means. That's where the CO2 comes in. They don't open as wide. And so the problem with sucking CO2 out of the air, which is what plants have to do, is for every CO2 molecule that diffuses into your leaf, you lose 100 water molecules diffusing the other way. So this is a real dilemma for the plant. It absolutely has to have CO2 to make sugar and grow, but it needs the water too. And so it's wasting lots and lots of water for every CO2 molecule that comes in. Mm. And so you partially fix that by increasing the concentration of CO2. Plants only put as many holes in the leaf as they absolutely need to get CO2. Mm. They wouldn't put any if they didn't need CO2. I mean, it's a complete loss. Mm. Yeah. So the big benefit of CO2 is making plants more resistant to drought and making them grow in regions that used to be too dry to grow at all. And there are other advantages too, but they're more subtle. For example, the main enzyme that is used to combine CO2 and water molecules into a sugar molecule is called rubisco. It's a acronym for a big, long, complicated word that I won't try and say on the air, but the molecule is extremely ancient. It may be at least 3 billion years old, probably a bit older than that. And when it was invented by evolution, or however it was invented, there was no oxygen in the air to speak of. So the atmosphere still had lots of nitrogen, it had water vapor, it had CO2, but no oxygen. And so this rubisco enzyme worked just fine 3 billion years ago when there was no oxygen, but it turned out it was oxygen was somewhat toxic to it. So now we have lots of oxygen in the air. We've got something like 20% oxygen, and this oxygen is poisoning the rubisco. So approximately 25% of rubisco potential efficiency is being lost today because of what they call photorespiration. The rubisco, when it can't find a CO2 molecule by mistake, will pick an oxygen molecule, and instead of making sugar, it makes things like hydrogen peroxide, which, you really don't want inside you. So the plants are full of sorts of, chemical fixes to this problem. It's too late to, re-evolve Rubisco. Everybody uses Rubisco. So what you have to do is cope with the consequences that it's poisoned by oxygen. That's one of the reasons that plants have all these antioxidants in them. You talk about antioxidants in health food stores, but one of the reasons they're there is to cope with the Rubisco's vulnerability to oxygen.
In 2019, was it, or 2018, you returned to the Oval Office because former President Donald Trump appointed you to attempt to debunk the negative associations in respect of carbon dioxide. But you retired a year later. How was that year?
Well, I swore never to go back to Washington after I left the first time, but somehow I'd forgotten, about that. And so when they called from the White House and asked if I would come down and help out at the National Security Council on Science and Technology, I said, well, I've already done things like that, and I'm already 80 years old. It's too, I'm too old to do that. And they said, well, come on anyway. And what's your price? I said, well, my price is I'll come if you will let me try and have a real review of climate, with honest back and forth and really competent people asking all the right questions and insisting on answers. If you'll let me try to do that, and if the president will sponsor that, so it's a presidential review, I'll come. They said, well, I don't know, it probably won't work. My boss was John Bolton, but he eventually says, okay, come on, give it a try, and if I can help, I will. So I came and I said, I'm going to get a year's lease for corporate housing. And at the end of the year, the lease will run out. And if something has happened, I'll renew it. Otherwise, I'm going home to Princeton again after a year. So you won't have to fire me because I've only got a year's lease. So I did. And I made some progress. I helped them on many things besides climate. That's not why they wanted me to come. They didn't want to touch climate because they thought it was politically too dangerous. It's like, discussing Social Security or
Very sensitive.
other controversial issues. It'll lose you votes, and there's no gain from it. But I thought that in the long term, it was very important to stop this hysteria because the huge damage was likely to follow. And we're already seeing some of that today, but it's going to get much worse if people don't come to their senses about climate. So anyway, I spent a year in the White House, and I did manage to persuade Mr. Trump to have a review against the advice of all of his advisors. So his advisors were furious with me, and they had all the levers of bureaucratic control. So although Mr. Trump wanted to do it, there were preparations and that had to be done, for addressing the people. And so they managed to drag out these preparations month after month after month. And eventually it was clear that it wasn't going to happen. Bureaucrats are very good at delaying things if they want to. And that's true in every country, and certainly true in America too. So my year was coming to a close, and I said, well, it looks like this is not going to happen. And, oh, well, we'll do it in the second term. I said, no, we're going to, unless now I'm on my way. And so I left, and but I gave it my best shot. I did try hard. Yeah. It's true that carbon dioxide, which is the main worry, is a greenhouse gas. That's been known for 150 years, the first person to really quantify that was the great Anglo-Irish physicist Tyndall, and he did work in the 1850s and 1860s that showed very clearly that carbon dioxide is perfectly transparent to sunlight. You can look at the sun through carbon dioxide, doesn't diminish sunlight at all. But if you try to look at, say, a hot fireplace through carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide shields you from the thermal radiation. So it's a funny gas. It's opaque to thermal radiation, but it's completely transparent to sunlight. And so that's a greenhouse gas, is a gas that lets sunlight come through and warm Earth's surface if there are not clouds in the way, but hinders the escape of thermal radiation back to space. The Earth has to get rid of the sunlight heating, otherwise, everything will heat up, the oceans will boil, we'll all be destroyed. It doesn't happen because the Earth radiates infrared radiation to space. So it was natural to wonder, well, if you add more CO2, would that cause the Earth to warm a lot? And the answer is no, it doesn't really make very much difference. As is often the case, this famous poem by Pope, a little learning is a dangerous thing, drink deeply or touch not the Pierian spring. It's a nice poem, but the message is that, yes, it's true, CO2 is a greenhouse gas and it warms the earth. But the second part of the message, which most people didn't get, was, but the warming isn't enough to matter. It's very small. And so it's probably beneficial on balance. But, if you double CO2, that seems like a lot. That's 100% increase of CO2. How much does that affect the cooling radiation goes off to space? That sounds like a lot, but in fact, it only decreases the radiation to space by 1%. So 100% increase of CO2, 1% decrease in radiation to space. So it's a very small effect. And you don't have to change the Earth's temperature very much or cloudiness very much to bring it back into equilibrium with this situation before you increase the CO2. So it's a ineffective climate influencer, and yet into this demon gas, that's going to cause us all to boil to death or something like that. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's a trivial gas, but it's very, very good for life on Earth. So more CO2 has been wonderful for mankind because it's helped provide the abundance of food that we have today, and it's caused no harm whatever. So it's amazing. It's a religious cult for many people. They don't really. Many people have stopped believing in traditional religions, so they don't believe in God, but they need something beyond themselves to believe in. And so, what could be more noble than saving the planet? The planet is threatened by the demon gas CO2, so we're going to save it. The fact that it means essentially suicide for the human race, that doesn't, I'll get into their brains, but that's what it means. You can't immediately eliminate CO2 and let the human population survive. It can't be done. So it's a suicide pact, what is being proposed. This is serious stuff. It should not go on much longer.
When I spoke to Dr. Judith Curry a few weeks ago, we got onto the topic of global warming, which she said is not harmful for the planet. And then when preparing for this interview, I came across an article which said that you have stated that historical and geographical records indicate that periods in the past have had much higher temperatures than we are experiencing now. So the models that the powers that be are using to tout this message that it's no longer just a climate change issue, it's now a climate emergency. The urgency of the language is just steadily rising. Are these models manipulated? And if so, by who and to what end?
Okay, well, it's true that I think there are some sincere politicians who have been misled by alarmist climate models. You know, if someone comes in with a PhD and, you know, director of an institute and tells you, you know, the Earth is going to be, 6 degrees warmer in 50 years, you have to listen to them and decide, should I take it seriously or not? I mean, the answer is, of course, you should throw them out of your office. You know, it's not true. But how do you know that if you're a politician? You usually don't have a very sound grounding in science. You hated mathematics when you were in school, couldn't wait to get out of that. And
Yeah.
so you're at the mercy of these salesmen. But models, parts of the model, there are some things you can model very well. One that I know quite a lot about is what they call radiative forcing. How much does carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide or methane affect the transport of radiation to space? That's close to my field in physics, so I probably understand it better than most climate scientists. And the answer is not very much. So there's not very much disagreement, you know, what the climate establishment calculates, the same as what I calculate, you know, it's straightforward. The mischief comes at the next step, you know. So if you change the radiation to space by 1%, you decrease it by 1%. How much does the Earth have to warm up to make up for 1%? Now, you actually don't need a supercomputer to make a first estimate of that. The first estimate, the simplest estimate, and it may be the correct estimate, is that radiation rate of the Earth goes approximately as the fourth power of the absolute temperature. It's the temperature multiplied by itself by 4 times, t to the fourth, right? That was discovered by a great Slovenian physicist, Stefan, back in the 1800s, about the same time as Tyndall was doing his work. Anyway, radiation to first approximation goes as the fourth power of the temperature. So that means that if the flux increases by 1%, the temperature only has to increase by 0.25%, 1/4. It's that 4 from the fourth power, right? So you can do this calculation in your head. So the surface temperature of the Earth is around 300 Kelvin. That's the absolute temperature unit. So that means that 0.25% of 300 Kelvin is 3/4 of a degree Kelvin, which is 3/4 of a Celsius degree, right? Kelvin increments are the same as Celsius increments. So, I mean, we can just do this calculation in our head that says doubling CO2. The most simple estimate is it would be a 3/4 degree rise in temperature. You can't even notice that. You know, my air conditioner at home doesn't trip, you know, if the temperature changes by 3/4 of a degree. I don't feel it. No, nobody would feel it. uh, and so this is for the alarmists, this is a tremendous disappointment. It's much, much too small. Who are we going to frighten with 3/4 of a degree? So you have to figure out, how do I make this look much more threatening? And so this means inventing feedbacks. And so the direct effect, you can't avoid. The direct effect is a little less than a degree centigrade from doubling CO2. But the next step is that you say, well, there are very large positive feedbacks which take this naive 3/4 of a degree and make it 3 degrees or 5 degrees. Or I've even seen 10 degrees. I mean, absolutely absurd numbers. They are clearly wrong. But again, if you're a politician and some sophisticated scientist comes in and says, yes, sir, there are these large feedbacks, and we're quite sure because our computer model shows it, and they're getting bigger every year. What are you supposed to do? You're at their mercy. And so I think the problem is that, these positive feedbacks have been introduced, in my view, just to maintain the alarm. And it's been very, very good for science. Huge amounts of money have been pouring in, to save the planet. And so it supports the salaries of lots of people and, secretaries and janitors who take care of the building.
It's become very emotionally charged.
Comes back to this religious part of the movement. The movement is, I joke a little bit, but it's very, it's not so different from a coalition of organized crime and religious fanaticism, right? And the religious fanatics, you don't argue with someone about their religion. This is not a joking matter. It brings crusades and religious wars and, God knows what. And, so that's the big problem. There are these two problems. One is all the money that it's bringing in to science. And so that's very corrupting. And the second is this religious aspect that so many people now have been brainwashed into thinking that there really is an emergency. And anyone who stands in the way of saving the planet, it's Satan incarnate, right? So, I for example, they're sincere people, but they're just badly misled. Yeah.
We've all seen the same photographs of a lone polar bear standing on a melting sheet of ice. These are the kinds of images that the world is seeing on the assumption that the ice caps are melting because the Earth is warming, and that the wildfires are one of several extreme weather events that have occurred in the last few years. Are these anomalies? Can they be explained in a way that has nothing to do with climate change? Or is it possibly, and this would be hard to digest, but propaganda to stoke fear?
Well, okay. The community, the alarmist community, recognized 20 years ago that the warming is a lot less than their models had predicted. They just you wait. They say sooner or later it will warm, but in the meantime we need something else to keep the alarm going. And so they seized on extreme weather and rising sea levels and ocean acidification. Things that really were not warming, and they changed the name from global warming to climate change. Right? Because the warming wasn't going to cut it. There's just not enough warming. And I explained to you why. It's not very easy to get warming from CO2. But, people are always affected by extreme weather. We've had hurricanes as throughout recorded history and long before. Wildfires are scary things, and they're getting worse in some areas, especially in the United States, where we've had very poor forest management. So, before the Europeans came to America, the Native Americans, the Indians, used to regularly burn large parts of America. There was constant smoke clouds coming from North America before the Europeans came. But that meant that the fires were never extreme, and this was good for hunting. It provided more grassland for deer and things that people hunted, and it also prevented enormous conflagrations like we're having today, when huge amounts of dry wood and brush have built up, and we every now and then it lets loose and it all burns at once. That never happened under the Indians, right? So it's true that fires are dangerous. They have nothing to do with climate change. It's mostly an effect of forest management, and I hope we'll reform that. If you get beaten up enough, eventually, sometimes you wake up on things like this. As for melting glaciers, yes, glaciers are melting. But, glaciers over the last 10,000 years have melted and then frozen again and melted and frozen again many times. In general, it's better when they're melting. The climate is better for people. When glaciers start growing, which they have quite frequently, it's usually a time of troubles for humanity. The earth cools, you can't make a crop in many areas. It tends to get drier too, so there are more droughts. So one should welcome, warming periods like we have now. But the current warming period began roughly 1800, 1850, something like that. That's pretty clear from glaciers. That's when all over the world glaciers started receding. There are some exceptions, some actually advanced, but most are receding. But there was this several century little ice age in the 1500, 1600, 1700, when the earth was quite a bit colder than normal. That's when the Norse settlements in Greenland, for example, were finally abandoned. You just couldn't farm Greenland anymore after 1300, 1400. It was too cold. Although it was quite possible to make a living there in earlier centuries. Year 1000, Greenland was a nice place. There were a lot of farms there then. So, Earth has an unstable climate, which isn't very well understood to this day, and it would be wonderful if we understood it better. But I think our ability to understand it has been set back very badly by the climate hysteria. So what could have been 20, 30 years of good basic research and real understanding of the climate has been wasted, with hysteria about this false climate emergency, which doesn't exist. And in the meantime, the real parts of the climate, which would be good to understand, have been ignored.
Just as an example, David Attenborough has joined the list of, let's say, celebrities, modern influencers, and said human beings are fundamentally incompatible with planet Earth. I found that to be quite a punch to the gut. And it's becoming the prevailing opinion. So, firstly, do you think there's any truth to that? And secondly, the consequence of everyone vigorously pursuing green and renewable energy Dr. Curry said that that is, in fact, the only climate risk that we face. So, what's your take on this?
Yeah, okay. You raise an interesting point because many of the most vociferous climate emergency folks, if you press them, they say, yes, the real problem is not fossil fuels, it's human beings. You know, there are just too many people. We have we should not have more than 1 billion people, you know, so that, you know, we're roughly 8 billion now. So that means 7 out of 8 of us should disappear from the planet. And so it's extremely dangerous, you know, it's an evil cult. And now people are hard to live with, as you and I both know. You know, they are opinionated, they're independent, and you know, unrestrained population growth is a potential problem. But the best way to stabilize populations is to make people prosperous. So if you look at prosperous parts of the world, Europe, North America, Japan, China now, population growth has stopped. You know, in fact, the big worry is how do we sustain enough people to run our countries? You know, because women are not having enough children to keep the population stable. And I don't blame the women. You know, who wants to be tied down with you know, a brood of, you know, 5 or 10 children out there? You know, it's a lot of work. You know. So, I mean, yeah, it's asking a lot of a woman to have the 2.1 on average kids or whatever it is, you know, to sustain population. And uh, so, if the alarmists really want a stable population, they should encourage prosperity and all around the world, but especially in Africa, in South America, in India, you know, regions where there are lots of people who are not yet wealthy, and they should be wealthy. You know, they why shouldn't they be just as wealthy as Europeans or Japanese or, you know? And the more wealthy they are, the slower population growth will be. And I'm quite sure that as the world becomes wealthy, and I pray that it happens and it's not derailed by human stupidity, which has often happened. But if we're lucky and it doesn't happen, the problem will be maintaining population. The population is naturally going to decline all over the world, and we'll have to figure out how do we live with that with very limited numbers of young people to support an aging, you know, fraction of the population all over the world, not just in the developed countries, but the currently undeveloped countries will be developed too, and so their populations will also start to decrease. And so I think it's you know, human beings they are a problem. You know, they are very inventive. You know, we figured out how to make nuclear weapons. You know, so we're capable of doing enormous damage to ourselves and to the planet. And these are issues that go well beyond my field of physics. You know, you can't solve these issues with differential equations. You know, and you know, smart theories. You know, it's the same sort of issues that the great sincere religions have tried to solve from time immemorial. How do we live together as human beings and live worthwhile lives and not be make life miserable for us and everybody else, you know, just by existing. So I don't know how you do that, and I hope we succeed. You know, perhaps religions have a role to play, perhaps philosophy. I don't know what's required, but it's very important, and we should all try to help make it happen.
Professor William Happer, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you for your time, and I'm Najaswat for BizNews.com.
Pleasure, Nadia. Bye-bye.